Good evening. It's great to see you again. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. It's great to see all of you, and I see quite a few people from Beijing and from the UK, from Belfast and from many other places around the world. And of course here also quite a few in North Carolina and in Chapel Hill. Our event today is entitled After Trump, the Future of the United States as a Global Power, Relations with China, the Middle East, Russia and Europe. We have 5 leading and very experienced experts who will give us their insights. There's one more event this semester, next week already, on November the 18th. At that time, we are discussing the future shape of American society after the elections, and that event will be featuring Bill Kristol and John Judis. Please don't miss it. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As you know, the Krasno Global Events Series features leading experts from academia, from diplomacy, the military, journalism, economics, and many other areas, and we always talk about issues of global concern. We have a wonderful website that is krasnoevents.com, and there you find a mailing form if you wish to be on our mailing list, or just send me an email and I put you on our mailing list. We also have a popular YouTube channel that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We videotape all our events and upload them to our popular YouTube channel. Please do me a favor and subscribe to our channel for free. And of course, watch our videos as often as you possibly can. They're all really good, as I keep saying. Tonight, we are dealing with US foreign relations under a Biden administration. As you know, President Trump still refuses to concede his election defeat, but this seems to be only a matter of time. It is pretty clear that Joe Biden is president-elect and will be the new US president from the 20th of January 2021. In the past 4 years, a lot has happened in American foreign relations. Once reliable alliances have become weaker, and many dictators and autocrats have found a more friendly welcome in Washington than had been the case before. We will discuss these developments and above all, ask what will be the foreign policy course of the incoming Biden administration. What kind of US foreign policy can we expect to see during the next 4 years? We have 5 great and very distinguished experts who will help us to understand what is going on and what is likely to happen in the near future. Let me just mention all of our speakers briefly. I'll introduce them in greater detail just before they make their initial remarks. With us today is Dr. Daniel Hamilton, who used to work for the State Department and is now at the Woodrow Wilson Center and at Johns Hopkins University in DC. He will talk to us about US relations with Europe and the European Union. Then I would like to welcome Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya of the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. She will enlighten us about the United States and Russia. Then there's Ambassador David Litt. He will talk to us about American relations with the Middle East. And then we have 2 distinguished experts on China, who obviously will talk about US-Chinese and Chinese-American relations. Thomas Orlik is a senior economist at Bloomberg and the former Wall Street Journal correspondent in Beijing. And Zitao Xu is a partner and chief economist at Deloitte, China, and he will join us actually tonight live from Beijing. And I'm very grateful that he is here because it's still very early in Beijing. I would also like to introduce our 2 formidable Krasno assistants, that is Brittany Broom and Pete Villasmil. I would like to welcome our panelists and all of you to our event tonight on After Trump, the future of the United States as a global power. Each speaker will talk for a maximum of 8-9 minutes. I will then pose a few questions to each of our speakers and try to find out more about their views. And then, as always, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. As you know, we would like you to submit your questions by means of the chat function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please be so kind to introduce yourself, to tell us your affiliation and the country and the city you're coming from. Our 2 Krasno assistants, Brittany and Pete, will select the most interesting questions and read them out aloud. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our event on the future of the United States as a global power, relations with China, the Middle East, Russia, and Europe. Our first speaker is Dr. Daniel Hamilton. Dan and I go actually back quite a few years when I had the privilege to be a fellow at the think tank Dan ran in Washington. Right now, Dan Hamilton is Austrian Marshall Plan Distinguished Fellow and the Director of the Global Europe Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He is also a Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. Formerly, Dan was the Executive Director of the think tank Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University. Dan is also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the Clinton administration. He also was U.S. Special Coordinator for Southeast European Stabilization, and he was an Associate Director of the Policy Planning Staff in the American State Department. In his initial remarks, Dr. Hamilton will talk about U.S. relations with Europe and the European Union. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Klaus. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. I think it's probably best to say that Joe Biden is the most transatlanticist president since Bill Clinton. He is passionate about the relationship. He has said that Europe is America's, quote, first resort when it comes to a host of global issues, and that I think instinctively he will turn to Europe when he has to confront a lot of different issues. How his administration overall deals with Europe, of course, is conditioned by many other types of challenges that we'll have. I believe our European colleagues are unfortunately likely to make two mistakes from the outset. The first one is already seeing. It's a collective sigh of relief. You can hear it. It's tangible. But it's accompanied with the words, we can go back to business as usual now. I think that's a mistake. I think the relationship that the US and Europe had has changed fundamentally, and the task now will be to reinvent the relationship, not to go back to some imagined past. The second mistake, and what that means, just to finish that thought, is that instead of preparing now for what Europe can say to a new administration in these critical 2 months of transition, I have a sense Europeans are waiting around, waiting for America. I think that's probably not the best use of time. I think the second mistake could come when the administration starts in office, because it will be confronted by a conflation of domestic crises that are quite stunning. I call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They're so bad. We have the ongoing pandemic. We're still in the first wave of the pandemic, and it's in fact the worst today than it's ever been. The discovery of vaccine, which is also a transatlantic, innovation accomplishment, won't change that anytime soon. We have then the attendant recession and the blow to the economy that's come with that. We have a massive social reckoning in this country that I believe in the end powered Joe Biden to the presidency, having to do with systemic racism and inequalities, each of which are being brought out by the pandemic and the recession. And then you have a 4-year legacy of Donald Trump, which has caused deep rifts and polarization in the country that one sees even right now in the aftermath of the election. That means the administration will have to turn to domestic challenges as its #1 priority. And I believe this will be misinterpreted abroad as isolationism, that the US is still turning away from the world following what the Trump administration had done. I think that'll also be a mistake, because if the United States can't help itself, it can't help many others. And domestic reform will have to be a precondition for a steady US presence globally. The two have to go hand in hand. Foreign policy, after all, begins at home. And it'll take some time for the administration to get its feet going, because many of our foreign colleagues, not maybe knowing the ins and outs of our system, we switch out the top 3,000 to 4,000 people in the government. and even transitioning between a friendly administration, which is this is not, takes months. It takes probably till mid-year next year before you would have the semblance of a full team in place. Many of these people have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. They have to have hearings and testimonies and background checks. It takes a long time. So, having said that, I think there are briefly issues that will come into the relationship that are just remain with us, regardless of which administration. There's a host of digital disconnects going on across the Atlantic right now. The Privacy Shield arrangement, which was to govern how personal data flows across the Atlantic, was rendered invalid by the European Court of Justice this summer. There's nothing in its place. The digital economy is becoming the economy. The densest digital connections in the world are between the US and Europe, and it's all been chilled now by this judgment and inability to sort of have a new framework. That's rooted in different domestic legal structures having to do with privacy and other issues, but it has huge commercial effects. And that won't be solved anytime soon. We have a tariff war going on right now. The EU just slapped new tariffs on the United States as part of the Boeing Airbus disputes. I would think the administration will want to wind down those tariffs and not have, declare national security reasons for slapping tariff on its own allies. But, these are long-standing issues that will continue. There's a whole issue of the reform of the WTO, which has been stymied at the moment. And then there's a very murky and unclear situation, it has nothing to do with the United States, but it will affect U.S. relations with Europe, and that's Brexit, because there's no UK-EU final deal. And I don't think there'll be clarity by the time the administration enters office. So how that affects a UK-US agreement plus US-EU relations will all be very up in the air come January. Just to finish out, I think, though, there is a basis for a positive agenda. I think the president-elect will want to reinvent the alliance in a positive sense and turn it toward common challenges. They start with the domestic challenges that I mentioned. That's a good basis, actually, for a transatlantic recovery initiative on the economic front. It's a good basis for thinking about how we distribute the vaccine, how we lower barriers to distribution of medical supplies and equipment, and just clear those away. One could do some quick things that would give a different sense of how we would work together on these challenges. I think the administration will try to reform the WTO from within the WTO and not try to blow it up. And there's common cause there with a number of countries. It will return to the Paris Climate Accord on day one. In fact, it set even more ambitious climate goals than the EU has. And the president has said he will host a global climate summit within 100 days of taking office. That frankly preempts the Paris COP arrangements, which planned for a summit next fall in the UK. I think one needs to understand the US is probably going to host a global summit 6 months before that, and one needs to disentangle that so that everyone's on track. I think there will be personally a charge to say NATO needs a new strategic concept. The alliance has a guiding document, strategic concept. The last one was in 2010. It's very out of date. And a strategic concept review is a good way to get people together in an agreed process to point the alliance to the future and not sort of, think about how much it's done in the past. So on all these points, there's a good basis for coming together. The last one I will mention is on China. I think President Trump was antagonistic to China, but he also sort of was trying to beat up on allies to kind of, beat them into line on his course toward China. And the result was, I think, he failed on both sides of his effort. The president-elect, I think, will turn naturally to his allies to say, we have some common concerns about China. How do we work on this together? It's not a anti-China coalition. I would just say the logical way to think about it is to take the EU's own framework, which is in some areas, China can be a partner. Where are those areas? Climate change occurs to me. There are many others probably. In some areas, China is a competitor. The US and the EU and the UK share many, many common concerns, as do other allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, about Chinese economic practices. That's a good basis for discussion. And then China is a systemic rival in terms of the norms and standards, institutions that it is pursuing in ways that are not understood well in the West. And that's another basis of discussion. So I think those are all very ambitious pieces of an agenda, and it's balanced by the trade-offs the administration will have to make with these huge domestic challenges, and of course, all the other problem areas of the world that we're about to hear more about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. Most illuminating. Biden also plans a summit of democracy. Will that not encourage the Europeans and other democratic countries that things will indeed go back to before Trump, Obama and Clinton, where the transatlantic allies were really the long-standing trusted allies of the US and will be appreciated accordingly in DC?
Well, part of the reason he wants to have that has been there's been a lot of Democratic backsliding. And I think even is important to NATO. I would suggest that the core of a NATO strategic review will be to affirm the alliance as a defensive alliance rooted in shared values. But many allies have stepped back from that, including the United States, frankly. I think we need to be first in line to admit that we've had some issues. But others are in that basket too. And the alliance has no way of discussing how to deal with that type of issue. And we can't allow it to continue because otherwise it makes it all dysfunctional. So I think if the president-elect goes ahead with that idea, it will be not just a triumphalist type of celebration of democracy. It will actually be a very tough discussion of how to sort of a self-reflective mood of how to make sure democracy works for people. That's a very different notion than the earlier community of democracies and the things from 30 years ago.
Thank you. That's interesting to know. We come to our second speaker, and that is Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya. Svetlana grew up in Russia, and she is now a senior analyst and director of the Russia programs at the National Security Archive at George Washington University in Washington. She was a lead organizer of the non-Lugar conferences on U.S. Russia cooperation and also lead organizer on 4 international conferences dealing with information access to the former Soviet Union and Russia. She's the author of multiple articles and books on US-Russian relations and the Cold War with the USSR. Svetlana was one of our speakers for a great event back in 2014 when she and her partner traveled to Chapel Hill to join us. And hopefully in the future, that is still possible again. But tonight, Svetlana will talk about US-Russian relations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I am honored to be with you. I know your audience is a great audience with great questions. And I would like to make one correction. I grew up in the Soviet Union, not in Russia. But so talking about the US-Russian relations now and under the new Biden administration, I think we have to state that today the relations between our two countries is at the worst period since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it is dangerous. It is not in the US interest to have relations with Russia in such a bad state. These countries are still two biggest nuclear powers. Russia and the United States possess 90% of all nuclear weapons. And right now, we basically don't have any guardrails or no strategic conversation between these two countries about how to secure these nuclear weapons. So I still think that the Biden administration will have a new promising approach to Russia. Of course, we're now talking in a new context. I would not call this context a Cold War or a new Cold War. It's a very different context, but we are in a period after Russia annexed Crimea. Russia is supporting conflict in eastern Ukraine. There is a major uprising in Belarus, right on the border of Russia. Russia feels like it has to support Lukashenko because Russia's concern is that Lukashenko will do a Ukraine and kind of try to join the Western alliance. At the same time, of course, Russians are trying to think about what is it that they could get from the new Biden administration. In terms of Trump administration, Russia had a lot of hopes, as we all knew, and there was interference by Russian actors in the elections of 2016, hoping that Trump will get elected, although I wouldn't say that this was the decisive factor or even a major factor. However, during the Trump administration, Russia was seriously disappointed. We observed essentially total destruction of the entire arms control mechanism that the Obama administration put so much effort into building. The United States withdrew from the INF Treaty. The United States did not renegotiate or extend the START Treaty, and the United States is also leaving the Open Skies treaties. All these treaties are very, very important from the Russian point of view, because essentially Russian status itself in the world is tied to its position as a nuclear superpower. Also, Russia traditionally, historically, in its foreign policy, likes treaties, likes big institutions, likes concert of big great powers, and it still sees itself as a great power. So all these expectations, all these hopes were not realized. And in a way, I think Russia might be experiencing somewhat of a buyer's remorse. It supported Trump so strongly, celebrated his coming to power, and then, relations deteriorated even worse. Right now, when we see in the relationship is a total lack of trust, just absolute lack of trust. Presidents used to be able to talk confidentially. They used to have back channels. If you look at the history of U.S.-Russian, U.S.-Soviet relations, that's no longer happening. There is a practical absence of any communications or contacts, even between diplomats and the military. The consulate staffs were drastically cut. Military to military talks essentially stopped. There are no back channels. If there is a crisis, nobody knows where and whom to call. There is heated rhetoric on both sides. Media is essentially unrestrained in criticizing the other side, promoting kind of the worst case scenarios, the worst rumors and stories about each other. There's also genuine anti-Americanism in Russia. There is a very suspicious attitude about everything Russian in the United States, but in Russia, the change is truly drastic. Even in the Cold War, there was no real anti-Americanism. There was the official propaganda, and there was genuine interest and actually love for everything American. In the Soviet Union, I remember it growing up. Now there is suspicion and there is stereotyping, kind of really basic black and white stereotyping. And the American public, as I mentioned, mainly relying on the mainstream media, is ready and willing to see Russian hand behind any negative development domestically. So why am I cautiously optimistic about the Biden administration? Biden has a lot of experience working both with Russia and with the Obama administration. I just recently looked back at any contacts or involvement Biden had with Russia, and I found a very interesting video of Biden's visit to the Soviet Union in 1979, when he was negotiating with some Russian foreign policy officials and Soviet Supreme Soviet members on SALT II. SALT II was just signed in July 1979, so Biden was in the Soviet Union in August 79, negotiating about ratification. He was also involved with Russians on negotiating the INF and the First START Treaty. Biden, in a way, is a real institutional legacy of the Obama reset. And as much as the Putin administration is suspecting him of being, anti-Russian and constrained by the Congress and ideological, they have that in mind. They do remember that Biden was actively engaged and that he was part of all the Obama initiatives in U.S.-Russian relations and on nuclear issues. So they see him also as part of that reset. The reset between Russia and the United States under the Obama administration was successful. Maybe it was not as successful as we were hoping, but nuclear security summits were held, a new level of contacts and consultations at every level of U.S.-Russian relations was achieved. The new START Treaty, of course, was signed. There was quite extensive cooperation on Afghanistan, cooperation on Syria and destruction of chemical weapons, and on the Paris climate deal, there was also a lot of interaction, and of course on the Iran deal. So if you look at the legacy of the Obama administration and Biden being part of that legacy, it actually gives you a really good starting point on dealing with Russia. So actually, if you would like to see what Biden sees as his priorities in foreign affairs and foreign policy, he published a really good article on foreign affairs, I believe in February of this year, which outlines his foreign policy priorities. And the first one is renewing democracy at home as a wellspring of American power. It does not say anything specifically about Russia, but does say a lot about arms control. So I would say there are three things that should be done. And the way I see the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, I think these will be the things that he actually would concentrate on. First of all, to open communications with Russia about strategic stability and restart the arms control negotiations. I think maybe even on day one, I hope so, the Biden administration would announce its commitment to extend first for 5 years the new START treaty and then hopefully to renegotiate it. Second, the Biden administration definitely will rejoin the Paris Agreement and will hopefully engage with Russia on climate change. This is a common interest and a common challenge. And thirdly, I think there will be cooperation between Russia and the United States on the pandemic response, maybe even on development and distribution of vaccines, especially in terms of providing cheap vaccines for the developing world. So these are my three main areas.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Belarus, which has been much in the news recently, how important is that to Putin? And Biden has also mentioned it in passing. So could Belarus lead to the first major crisis already in Russian-American relations under Biden?
Well, this is this is a very good this is a very good question. I think the Putin administration sees Belarus primarily through geostrategic lens. I think dialogue is possible, but you would expect Biden certainly to give support for the Democratic opposition. Putin is not completely wedded to Lukashenko. I think Putin would be willing for a possible exit for Lukashenko if there are some understandings reached with the United States and with Europeans about some status for Belarus, so Belarus will not be immediately pulled out of the Russian sphere of influence. You know, I think we have to understand that for Russia, Belarus is so strategically important. And Putin does not care about the domestic regime in Belarus or who actually is in power. And he could see Lukashenko go, but he has to be assured in some way that it would not immediately mean invitations to join EU, NATO, or any other close cooperation with the West.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. Right, let's come to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ambassador David Litt. David has also been a past speaker for a couple of times, and I'm happy to say he is also one of our loyal supporters and followers. David Litt is Executive Director of the Center for Stabilization and Economic Reconstruction here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He is a former ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. He also was Consul General in Dubai and the third ranking official at the US Embassy in Baghdad in Iraq. David has had such a long and fruitful career as a member of the US Foreign Service that I can hardly mention all the many distinguished positions he has held. In his initial remarks, Ambassador David Litt will talk about US relations with the Middle East. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Klaus. It's a daunting task to talk about the future of American power in the Middle East under a Biden administration in under 10 minutes. It's a very complex, very interwoven region that stretches essentially from Morocco to Iran. But I'll try to hit the wave tops and construct a framework for you to understand and see these sets of issues, and then we can talk in detail in our question and answer session. I will start with what are America's principal interests in the Middle East in this third decade of the 21st century. In other words, why is this region really important to us? Some people say, well, we shouldn't be involved in the Middle East anymore. Well, the fact of the matter is that the Middle East continues to be a highly unstable region, politically, socially, and economically, and it's the source of a great deal of hot regional conflict and violent terrorist groups that want to do harm to the United States and our allies. In many ways, this region is worse off than it was in the second half of the 20th century. And this instability and violence has direct and significant impacts, especially on our friends and allies in Europe. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The second reason why this region is important to us is because of its continuing centrality in oil and gas production for the global economy, not so much for the United States, but especially for our allies and friends in East Asia, and also the contribution from the Middle East in this oil and gas production in the regional conflicts and the instability. It's a vicious cycle in many parts of the Middle East. And then the final point of why the Middle East is important to our interests is something that I believe that national security experts tend to undervalue, and that is the historical and religious contributions to European and American societies and economies that come from the Middle East. We have just had an experience of 4 years of some great civics lessons for the United States. We have been reviewing our history, American government, in the debates that we have gone on, and we've discovered the value of understanding history in understanding today's current politics. Well, I would say the same thing applies in the Middle East, that the historical dynamics today underpin the complexity of Middle East societies, and they're an intrinsic part of the reasons for today's instability and conflict. Namely, we all know that the Middle East is the origin of the three great religions whose faith the vast majority of Americans accept. But secondly, the Middle East is also the origin of much of the original science and mathematics and engineering, medicine, astronomy, physics, optics that are the foundations of modern human civilization. And then thirdly, the Middle East, this entire area from Morocco to Iran or Iberia to Persia, has been central to European trade and economies for a couple of millennia, especially, certainly since the Roman Empire. So those are America's interests. Now, what should America's policy goals under a Biden administration in this Middle East be? Well, first and foremost, and we've already heard this already from many in the future administration, is to reestablish America's credibility and influence in the region. America in the 70s and 80s and 90s, in particular, when I was a foreign service officer, had a tremendous amount of credibility. And that has waned significantly, especially since 9/11, but secondly, after the Arab Spring 2011 and 2012. And as our influence has waned, our adversaries and also some unhelpful allies have rushed in to fill the vacuum. Certainly Russia, China, Iran, but also Turkey and Egypt with respect to North Africa, and Saudi Arabia, and even the United Arab Emirates, again with respect to North Africa, but also in particular with respect to Yemen. So we need to establish American credibility. Second, we need to focus on reestablishing stability in concert with our friends and allies. And that it will involve preventing, reducing, or mitigating conflict, certainly not enhancing conflict in this region, because this will help to undermine the terrorism that springs from this region. And finally, I would say in terms of a policy goal, an overall policy goal is to continue to support or resume support for vulnerable populations and for citizens in the region who are targets of human rights abuses. So now how can America achieve these goals? Great goals. How do we get there? The number one thing to do is to repair our own domestic institutions, especially in national security, primarily diplomacy and international economic development in the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, to repair the intelligence community, and also to repair and improve a proper role for the Defense Department and our military alongside these other elements of national power to work together, not to have defense and the military always to be the first tool we reach for. The other institution we need to repair is America's economic power, and in particular, those economic principles that favor the values that we promote in this region: fairness and playing by the rules, the benefits of openness and free markets and freedom of navigation, the equality of economic opportunity, and then, of course, providing economic development assistance to those who most need it. All right, we need to repair our institutions. And then we need, first and foremost, to promote and assist in the development of effective governance across this region. More than anything else, I would argue that helping to promote effective governance will help us to achieve all of our other goals. And when I talk about effective governance, I mean governance that prioritizes citizen participation, that prioritizes the transparency of institutions and processes in Middle Eastern countries, and that prioritizes accountability under their rule of law, that is, under their legal system that their societies accept as legitimate. But governance also means respecting the rights of their citizens. And finally, good governance and effective governance does not necessarily need to look like American or European political or economic systems. And that's for a strategic look. In the near term, the United States must prioritize 5 hot zones that contribute most to regional instability and conflict in this region. And those are namely Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and then the Gulf in general, that is Iran's conflicts with its Arab neighbors, principally Saudi Arabia. It will take us a long time to go into any of those in particular. I'm happy to do that in Q&A. But we can't achieve these goals alone. We need to restore America's collaborative participation with our friends and allies in the region and also globally, which means, again, as my colleagues have said, to rebuild America's role in its alliances with its European partners in NATO and the European Union, because it is, as I said before, the European countries that are most directly affected by Middle East instability and fragility due to massive emigration out of the Middle East and also from Africa from the Middle East. But also our East Asian, to rebuild our East Asian alliances and partnerships with respect to their major stake in the Middle East, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, to name a few. So rebuild our alliances and friendships, but also we need to improve the effectiveness of our diplomatic relationships with our principal adversaries in order to find common ground to achieve America's goals and to achieve America's interests. Number one, of course, or the primary ones are Russia and China. And we have worked very effectively with Russia and China in the Middle East in the past. For example, with respect to Iraq in the 1990s through the UN Security Council, and then more recently with Iran in the lead up to bringing Iran to the negotiating table for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Without, I would argue, without China and Russia exerting pressure on Iran, we would never have gotten to where we are. And then, of course, reestablishing a diplomatic dialogue with Iran, because we have a lot to talk about with Iran, and we have to reduce the prospect of conflict in the region, not enhance it. And then finally, we need to strengthen America's relations with our key regional players in ways that will have them cooperate much more productively toward regional stability. First and foremost, I would list for among Middle Eastern countries is the United Arab Emirates, not just because I served 6 years there, but for a lot of other reasons that I think the UAE has demonstrated its influence, and I'm happy to talk about that more in detail. But secondly, Saudi Arabia. We have problems with Saudi Arabia, but we have to engage in a way to make them much more productive, as well as other countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, especially Kuwait, who just lost its premier, Sheikh Sabah, and Oman, whose sultan also passed away recently. Both of those countries had in the past played very effective roles as mediators in conflict in the Middle East, but also countries like Egypt and Jordan, who need to be brought in more effectively into helping to produce more stable outcomes in the Middle East. And I'm confident that the Biden administration, which as its work throughout the 8 years of the Obama administration, has already laid the groundwork. They know the actors, they know the procedures and the processes. I think we're going to be able to get there. Well, that's my brief outline for the future of the United States as a power in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, David. This sounds like, well, an optimistic outlook. You, if I interpret that correctly, you are quite optimistic that the Biden administration can shape things in a new, energetic way. Just let me ask you about that conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the conflict which seems to define the nation, the Middle East right now. Trump was more hostile to Iran and more friendly to Saudi Arabia than previous administration. Do you think that will be reversed, or what can the Biden administration do to de-escalate that, really, that conflict?
Yes, I don't know that it's a question of reversal. It's a question of utilizing the instruments of our power to make Saudi Arabia, which is a friend of ours, much more effective in reducing the temperature. We do not want conflict in the Gulf. We do not want to conduct ourselves in such a way as the inexorable conclusion of America's role in the Middle East is war in the Gulf. Nobody wants that. So we have to use our levers with our friend Saudi Arabia and use our levers with our adversary Iran in order to accomplish just that, to achieve, frankly, our objectives, which I stated just before.
Thanks very much. We will talk more about that later, and we haven't mentioned Israel at all, so we will have to cover that too.
Absolutely.
Let's come to our next speaker. That is Thomas Orlik. Tom Orlik is chief economist for Bloomberg Economics in Washington, D.C. Formerly, for more than 10 years, he was based in Beijing as Bloomberg's chief Asia economist, and he also was China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Tom Orlik also is a former advisor to the UK executive director of the International Monetary Fund, and he was a policy analyst and speechwriter for the British Treasury. Tom has just published a new book. It is entitled China, the Bubble That Never Pops. It has come out with Oxford University Press this year, and it is, of course, available in all good bookshops and, of course, from Amazon.com. In his initial remarks, Tom Orlik will talk about the United States and European relations with China.
Well, thanks very much, Klaus. It's great to be here. In addition to hearing the remarks from the distinguished panel, my main objective is, of course, shameless publicity for my book. So eagle-eyed viewers will note that I have strategically positioned a copy above my right shoulder as a subtle subliminal message to the audience about how they should shape their behavior going forwards. And I'll be closely monitoring the Amazon rankings to see if that had the desired effect. I think it's clear that the last 4 years has been a very challenging period for US-China relations. Focusing on the economics of it, we have had tariffs imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars in goods flowing in both directions. We have had sanctions imposed on Chinese technology companies. We've had the threat that the US would move to break up ByteDance, one of China's most successful technology companies, the firm behind the phenomenally popular TikTok app. As the world looks forward to welcoming President-elect Joe Biden, the question is this a possibility? Is there a possibility for a reset? Well, I'm sure the career Foreign Service professionals on the panel will think this is a very simplistic way of thinking about things. But the way I conceive of US-China relations is on two spectrums. A strategic spectrum, where there's a US choice between engagement with China and containment of China, and a tactical spectrum, where there's a choice between narrow, procedural tactics or broad, unpredictable tactics. Now, under past administrations, from Bill Clinton to George Bush to Barack Obama, broadly speaking, the US had a strategy of engagement with China and used tactics which were narrow and procedurally predictable. Under Donald Trump, things have swung completely to the opposite end of the spectrum. The strategy has become one of containment, and the tactics have become broad and unpredictable. Some people called it the madman theory of international relations. So my baseline view is that under a Joe Biden presidency, we're going to move some way, but not all the way back on those spectrums. So strategy is going to shift from an extreme containment strategy to something which is more balanced, with some elements of engagement and some elements of containment. And tactics are going to swing from broad, unpredictable, the madman theory of international relations, to tactics which are more procedural, more predictable, more transparent. So my base case is that this is going to be a chance for a reset on some important areas like intellectual property protection, like market access, like who controls the core technologies which will determine competitiveness in the future of the global economy. There is going to be continued, perhaps intense rivalry. But on other areas like climate change, there is going to be scope for a return to a cooperative approach. And the overall pattern is going to be one which is governed by the sort of the restoration of norms of governance and norms of diplomatic dialogue. So that's my base case, but it's not necessarily the case that things are going to play out that way. We already heard from Dan Hamilton that a Biden administration might be one which is better at working with allies. What happens if a Biden administration picks up the phone to London and Berlin and Tokyo and Seoul and attempts to convince leaders there that they need to come with the United States on its China strategy, and they need to adopt a coordinated approach on intellectual property protection, market access, who owns core technologies. Well, that might make sense from the potential of Washington, D.C. I think it would actually have the potential to trigger a further deterioration in relations, because from the Beijing perspective, that would look like a coordinated containment attempt, not something that Beijing would welcome. An additional point I think we need to keep in mind, and I think it's something which we overlook too often in Washington, D.C., is that the US is not the only partner who is making a decision about what the relationship should look like. Beijing is also making a decision about what the relationship should look like. Now, I don't have a window into Zhongnan High. Perhaps we'll hear a little bit more about the Chinese perspective from Setao. Looking forward to hearing his comments in a moment. But if I was sitting in China's leadership compound, I suspect that after 4 years of trade wars, after all of the name calling and blame game over the COVID crisis, then I would be thinking about ways to reduce my dependency, my reliance on the United States. And indeed, in many ways, that's what the new dual circulation strategy that we're hearing about from Beijing is aimed at reducing dependencies on US finance, US technology, increasing China's self-reliance. So my base case is that there's a reset. It's possible that relations actually continue to deteriorate. One additional point on that, climate change is often mentioned as a sort of a win-win area, right? An area where everyone has to cooperate. And it's certainly true from a global perspective that cooperation on climate change is necessary. But the winners from cooperation, the gains from cooperation on climate change, the gains from an effective move towards carbon neutrality are not evenly distributed. China, India, other emerging markets lose more if climate change goes unchecked, and they gain more if there is a smooth transition to carbon neutrality. The US also loses if temperatures rise and gains if there is a smooth transition to carbon neutrality, but they don't gain as much as China, India, and other big emerging markets. So even on that sort of that supposed win-win kumbaya issue of climate change, there's actually the scope for geopolitical rivalry to play a role as well. So not our base case, but we've modeled a scenario where US-China ties continue to deteriorate. We have looked at the historical relationship between US-China trade and technology ties and potential growth in both countries. And what we've discovered is that the relationship is more beneficial for China than it is for the United States. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because China is still the country playing catch up in terms of technology. So when the two countries share ideas, trade, share technologies, China gains more, the US gains, but it doesn't gain as much. So in that risk scenario, where ties continue to unravel, and we have something which looks more like a comprehensive decoupling, we would expect a larger blow to China's growth than we would see in the United States. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we actually know who Xi Jinping preferred to win the election, and why has Xi Jinping not yet congratulated the president-elect? Any idea about that?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. So I think that there's a sort of human tendency towards hubris, right? We saw it in Japan in the 1980s, where there was a narrative about American decline. I think if we looked at the Chinese press today, and the Chinese press in the sort of the final months of the Donald Trump administration, with COVID cases raging, with unemployment high, I think we might see signs of that hubris again in the Chinese view on China. Now, perhaps a Biden win changes that narrative and shifts that view in Beijing. At the same time, I think that the Trump administration, both because of what it's done, the tariffs, the sanctions, and because of the way it's done it, the unpredictability, the tweets, the backwards and forwards, has, I'm sure, not made a huge number of friends in Beijing. And so if I was a diplomat thinking about relations with the United States, I might welcome a shift to an administration that is probably going to be more procedurally predictable, easier to engage with on that sort of basic diplomatic relations level.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That makes a lot of sense. Let's come to our final speaker tonight. That is Sitao Xu, who has joined us from Beijing. And you may remember that Sitao was also one of our speakers in the recent past, that is last year. And at that point, Sitao was actually able to travel to Chapel Hill to be with us. I hope that will be possible again in the near future. Sitao Xu is chief economist and partner at Deloitte, China. Formerly, he was chief representative of the Economist group, and he was forecasting director of the Economist intelligence unit in China. He also used to be a senior economist for Asia at Société Générale and at the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and at the Standard Chartered Bank. In his initial remarks, Sitao Xu will talk about China's relations with the United States and Europe. Over to you, Sitao.
Klaus, thank you very much. This is going to be challenging because China has been discussed by everyone. And of course, Tom has done a very good job. So it will be difficult for me not to overlap with them. So this is what I'm going to do. Just the past few minutes, I decided just to change my tactic. What I like to do is, first of all, I would speculate the baseline scenario, US and China under Biden administration. Then I will make some suggestions what adjustment have to be made by both countries in order to have a reset and more healthy relations. Then, of course, finally, I will make a prediction. So if I begin with my baseline, baseline is, I think, first of all, the issue come to people's mind is trade, tariffs. Based on how I been monitor the US election, I don't think the trade issue tariffs will be very high on his policy agenda. Oh, by the way, due to various reasons, China's export have been doing extremely well this year. And for various reasons, bilateral deficit between China and United States have not changed much, notwithstanding the fact the tariffs against Chinese export is 25%. But I think the good news is, at least from China's perspective, we are going to see a flaw of bilateral relationship, and after 4 years of free fall. I mean, I think that's the view taken by both policymakers and the business people. I also think from Biden administration perspective, there will be a greater urge or longing for coming back to Asia, pivotal to Asia. The reason is very simple. This part of the world would continue to have better growth than rest of the world. I don't want to bore you with the details on my forecast from Australia, New Zealand to China, Hong Kong, Taiwan in 2021. Almost everyone will see the pre-crisis level of economic output by 2021. Of course, for China, I think the growth can easily be between 4 to 5%. I'm sure all of you can read Tom's book, Why China's Bubble Never Popped. So there will be greater urge for Biden administration to come back to this part of the world, to maybe strike special trade arrangement with ASEAN countries or some countries. So what does that mean? I would not say US would join CPTPP right away, right? That's a newer version of TPP. But the pressure really for China to open up the economy more. The comprehensive regional agreement was just being wrapped up. That's mainly between China and ASEAN countries, of course, Korea. The tariff rate between China and ASEAN region now virtually zero. So the test is for China whether to actually aim the bar higher to join CPTPP. So that's trade. On technology, I very much agree with what Tom has said, but I think US approach will be more selective and focused. And for those who have been covering key issues involving Huawei, my understanding is some of these restrictions have been eased in a quite subtle manner. As a matter of fact, last week, I was in Shenzhen. I had opportunity to talk to senior executives of ZTE, who was being sanctioned by the US. A lot of these people were very optimistic. As a matter of fact, the stock of the company went up by 30% on Biden's victory. So I think if you look at how platform economy is working, whether in the United States or in China, if we really get into this verification, two standard and all this, that will be bad for everyone. So my prediction is restrictions will be selective. So moving on to other issues, and I think in your lecture series, you have featured speakers covering Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, all this. I think those issues will stay. They will remain at the source of tensions. But I do believe Biden administration will trade a quite fine line, particularly on Taiwan. And neither party really has incentive to see escalation at this point. So again, if you look at all this geopolitical economic issue, not just from China's perspective, but from Asia Pacific perspective. So what do we see? So I always use Australia as an example because that's the most staunch ally of the United States. And to quote former Australian Prime Minister John Howard, he said Australia was deputy chef of the United States in Asia Pacific. Now, you might be shocked to hear this data point. If you look at Australia's exports to China, that's equal to Australia's export to the United States, Japan, Southeast Asia put together. So this is a relationship. China is your business partner, your biggest client, but United States is your friend. How would you make choices? Not to mention country like Australia, economically, it's not competing with China. It's extremely complementary economically. It doesn't have a manufacturing sector. So I think if for any countries in our part of the world, pick any country, Singapore, no one wants to make the choice between China and the United States. So on that, I'm still slightly optimistic. I think the reset clearly will involve adjustment from both sides. So what adjustment US has to make? First of all, sometimes in China, all these expressions are slogans. Do you really want to take them too seriously? I mean, dual circulation, for example. So I think US, in hindsight, should join AIIB and all this, in other words, to share power leadership with China. What adjustment China has to make? I think if you listen to all these speakers, essentially people say China is a competitor. At the same time, it represents huge business opportunities. So I think the test for China is whether market access improvement can really meet business community's expectation. And because low trust, right now, all this has to be verified. I think what surprised people from the past 4 years is the Trump administration decided to take this, whether you call that a madam approach or just be more frank. I think sometimes if you take this frank approach, maybe issue can be addressed in a more efficient manner. So finally, I would give my prediction. I think within 1 year, Joe Biden will visit Beijing. I will stop right here.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's hope he visits Europe first, I would say. Let me just briefly ask you, the Biden administration is supposed to emphasize human rights much more so than the Trump administration. This is likely to not to please the Chinese leadership. Do you see that if that is the case, that human rights, Xinjiang and other trouble spots like also Taiwan and Hong Kong, of course, that can lead to more friction rather than better improved relations, as you just
said? I think on Hong Kong, I don't see any major changes from the new administration because decision taken by Trump administration, whether on export or sanctions against individuals, they were bipartisan. So I really don't see many changes. But at the same time, I also think the bar of national security law will be quite high going forward. So I think both sides will be cautious. On Taiwan, it's not a human rights issue, is geopolitical. I think US will really tread a very fine line to use this concept. US will remain strategically ambiguous, right? That has been the policy in past many years. I also think on human rights, sometimes you cannot be, really too dogmatic, right? You have to be practical. But of course, there will be greater emphasis on human rights, particularly if we have people like Susan Rice potentially being Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me ask one question to all of our panelists before we open it up to questions from the audience. That question would be, when listening to you, all of you, perhaps a little bit with the exception of Dan Hamilton, everyone was quite optimistic and encouraging that the future will be better and more constructive and more multilateral. You know, these high hopes are bound to be disappointed. Is that not likely that our optimism is so high, our expectations are so high that we will be disappointed within a few months? What are the major hurdles which we would find perhaps where Biden wouldn't be as constructive as we all hope? Dan, would you like to approach that?
Well, I indicated some of it will be legacy issues that the U.S. is facing around the world they continue, regardless of administration. And many issues also one has to keep in mind are partly determined by the Congress in terms of funding for priorities. And the Congress, the complexion of the Congress is going to be up in the air until January. My basic point was we have to live with uncertainty more than good or bad for a good period of time. Even with the best of intentions, any new administration, it's not just this one, has to go through a process. And even though many of the people are veterans and people know who they are, it just takes some time. And I think the sorting process there will be important. I think what is maybe the positive side of that is you have a president who knows that. He's been through these transitions before. He knows the messaging and the importance of it at critical junctures. He has announced an ambitious 6-month program on a number of international fronts that we mentioned. The climate agenda is a huge one. You mentioned the democracy thing. He has made a big point. He also wrote an article, I'm not sure if people read it, saying that corruption is a national security issue. And I would imagine you will see a very high emphasis in a new type of sort of, global kleptocracy initiative or something that's really going to be much more serious than what you might have seen in the past about those issues. And it's not allies or adversaries, it affects everyone. Many Western countries, are conduits for all sorts of crazy money that's flowing through places. So it's not directed anywhere. And then I think you'll see a attention to sort of the structures of world order. I think that's a thing that President Trump really didn't care too much about. But I think you see a Biden administration thinking hard about it. Back to the Congress, the last piece will be whether there's money. Part of what happened during the Trump administration is not that it wasn't about sharing burdens, it was about shedding burdens and zeroing out big parts of policy where they didn't think there was a priority. Foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, lots of regional types of engagement that had been funded in the past by the United States were zeroed out by the Trump administration. The Congress had to put the money back in. But in the end, they couldn't, of course, force them to spend it. They had it, but they didn't spend it. And I think you'll see just a very different approach. You'll see a restoration of funding in some areas where the U.S. has sort of been, AWOL for the last number of years.
Thanks very much, Dan. Svetlana, do you want to come in?
Well, I'm not that optimistic. I think we certainly will not have a full-scale reset. I don't think we're going to have a truly cooperative relationship between the United States and Russia. But I do think that on the most important questions, the questions really of survival, be they nuclear security or pandemic or climate change, in these 3 spheres, I do see cooperation. And I think we will see cooperative steps very quickly on nuclear arms control. And here I don't think I will be disappointed. In terms of more general improvement of US-Russian relations, it would be very difficult because sanctions, of course, are congressionally mandated, and looking back at the history of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that, every president for the last 30 years said they would repeal, but they never were able to do it. Sanctions will be there for the foreseeable future. However, in the areas where the United States has a strong national interest, I think we will see real movement.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And David Litt, would you like?
Yes, I'm optimistic, but I wear that badge proudly because after the last 4 years, it's all relative. I think the most important thing that the Biden administration must do, and it will do, is to set expectations properly and not lead the American people on that this is going to be easy, that all you have to do is make this transaction or that transaction and everything is going to be fine, or all we have to do is withdraw our forces and then we have withdrawn from an area. No, we can't do that. So we have to be, the administration will have to be very clear with the American people on its goals and recognize that it's going to be a long slog, but the good news is that we are going to have the expertise in the institutions in order to do this properly for the interests of the United States. The bad news is that I'm afraid we see the outgoing administration sowing some poison pills in a variety of different sectors that may make it even harder for the administration to accomplish its goals. But we're just going to have to soldier on.
Thanks very much. And Tom, what do you think?
So very broadly, we can think about policies which impact the global economy in two ways. Do they make the pie bigger or not? And how do they impact the way the pie is divided up? Now, in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, when the USSR had crumbled and China was still emerging from isolation, the US really didn't have any geopolitical rivals. And so the US could think about most problems through the lens of making the pie bigger, right? Didn't really matter how that gain was divided up. The US would get something, other countries would get something. Policies that made the pie bigger were good. That's why China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization, for example. Now, as we see China very rapidly closing the gap with China, the question of whether policies make the pie bigger or not is becoming secondary to the question of what impact does this policy have on how the pie is divided up. And that is going to impact, I think, US policy on two crucial issues: trade and climate change. Free trade and an early fight against climate change make the pie bigger, but they make the pie bigger more for China and other emerging markets than they do for the United States. And that concern about the distributional impact of policies, I think, was, the key characteristic of foreign policy under the Trump administration. I think the Biden administration is going to move a little bit away from that. I think it will be hard for them to move all the way away from it.
Thank you. Shitao, do you want to come in as well?
What will be your question?
Are we too optimistic? Will we see a great disappointment after a few months that our hopes in a more constructive, more multilateral Biden administrations are too high?
Okay, so well, again, Tom has brought up the issue of pie, right, distribution. So I would say, if you look at this relationship, China-United States, we know that the key reason is lack of trust. And one of the reasons is really misunderstanding. In past few years, the Trump administration has been using this buzzword, reciprocity. That word, even until recently, in China, was being translated as mutually beneficial. If you think about that mutually beneficial and the reciprocity are actually quite different. I will treat Klaus well if he treats me well. and I will treat you badly if you treat me badly, right? I mean, that's very different. So I think, are we going to have continued misunderstanding between Beijing and Washington? I think potentially that's really a risk, particularly on, for example, the new economic policy due circulation. A lot of American companies, they pay great attention to this, because if there is really massive import substitution, as in Russia, I mean, they will stand to lose, right? That means, the percentage of domestic contents, so on and so forth. I don't think China can do that, simply because China does not have the natural resources as Russia does. But nevertheless, misunderstanding represents one risk. I think the other risk is, if we look at 2021, I mean, economic growth right here where I am is actually quite strong, and people travel freely, right? If you look at how government dealing with COVID-19, a few weeks ago, about 15 cases emerging in this port city, Wuhan, and the city government took 5 days to test 9 million people. Again, I repeat, it took 5 days to test 9 million people, which is unthinkable elsewhere. So if we continue to have this contrast, economic performance, China versus developed world, I'm not sure at some point people will bring this up. The really what Australia launched initially to have independent investigation of the origin of COVID-19, that could really exacerbate the distrust. I will stop right here.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me turn to Brittany, and Brittany has prepared the first question, I believe. The first question from the audience. Over to you.
I have, thank you. Our first question is from Clayton Dowd from National Defense University, and it is for Ambassador Litt. The question is, how do you see the current workings for Israel peace deals with multiple Middle East countries advancing or failing under a Biden administration? And will it help stabilize relations in the region?
I would acknowledge that some of the developments under the Trump administration with respect to Israel and its Arab neighbors, or at least neighboring countries, are very valuable building blocks toward a greater strategy. But I think the analysis has to be that we have had 4 years of little transactions here and there that don't amount to any kind of broader strategy. The Middle East is full of wicked problems. That is, you make some progress on one problem and it strangles the other. So this is a question of getting our strategies straight, embedding good developments within that strategy, and then managing it as best we can in ways that reflect good diplomatic practice, but also adherence to strong American policies. So with respect to Israel and its relations with the Arab world in particular, the new normalization with UAE and Bahrain are extraordinarily positive. They show to the rest of the Arab world the benefits of Arab-Israeli communication, Arab-Israeli cooperation, Arab-Israeli trade, Arab-Israeli innovation. For decades, Israelis were demonized in the Arab world, and frankly, Arabs were demonized inside of Israel. Break that paradigm and everything becomes possible, but you need to make it part of a broader strategy in order to build trust. And that we look at the model of what Secretary James Baker did at the end of the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and then later into the Clinton administration, of having that kind of strategy and allowing developments that maybe were not of our own making, like the secret talks between the PLO and Israelis. I mean, we were able to help build toward a grander strategy, and that's how we need to go forward. Not picking off this low-hanging fruit, making an agreement here or an agreement there.
Thank you. What about the two-state solution? Will that be revived under Biden, or is it gone for good?
No. Well, whether it's gone or not, it will depend a lot on Israel and the Palestinians. But no, I think that the Biden administration is going to make every effort to revive it. Keep in mind that the United States, with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, has to juggle contemporaneously 4 different policies: an unswerving support for the state of Israel, a credible and even-handed role as an effective intermediary for a two-state solution, which we have given up, which we had given up. We need to return to that. An unquestionable champion of respect for human rights, which is going to be essential if we are going to play that even-handed role, and then an unambiguous opponent for the use of terror to achieve political ends. Everyone needs to see that. And if we get back to that kind of American policy and American position, never mind if it's with respect to Israel or the Palestinian Authority or to the Iranians or to anyone else, then we'll be able to build upon a proper return to the peace process. It is really a sad moment that Saeb Erekat just recently passed away from COVID-19, by the way. One of the most formidable and effective intermediaries for Middle East peace, but there will be others. Now it's up to the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority to do their job.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Pete. Do you have another question?
Yes, we'll offer this question to Dr. Hamilton. President Trump undermined a number of domestic and international institutions. Which will be most difficult and which most easiest for a Biden administration to repair?
Well, there's a number of things, immediate steps. I don't know if you repair it, but it's important that you're in them. The president took us out of some agreements. So the Paris Climate Accords is one. That whole COP process will be restored. Then the hard work starts again. But as I've already talked about, I think the administration will have very ambitious plans there, not only to be part of it, but to lead it. The second is the WHO. The president had said we were leaving the WHO. Well, President Biden will put the US right back in it immediately, and also try to reform it, because I think the pandemic has shown the WHO needs some work. The other one is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Again, I mentioned, I think the president was never a fan. It has, an adjudication part of the WTO that is not working well. The Trump administration's tactic was just to stop it and not to let it function and atrophy. I think the Biden administration approach, my personal view, will be to stay within the WTO to try to reform it from within. There's already a U.S. EU Japan dialogue on WTO reform and issues of common concern. That never went anywhere, but it still exists. And I think you can use coalitions within formal institutions to move things forward. In the current world I was asked to talk about, of course, the primary one that was hollowed out and beat up on and deteriorated was NATO. It is America's premier alliance, and yet the president used it as a protection racket. If you don't pay, you don't get protection. I had gone so far to say, in a second term, NATO probably would no longer have existed. It might have existed in name, but never in reality, because allies would never trust the U.S. Security guarantee. I think that'll be reversed, and I've laid out where I think the Biden administration can reframe NATO, get it on track again. But I think it'll be U.S. leadership there that'll make a really big difference, and that'll happen very quickly.
Thank you very much. You want to say briefly anything about the first major, the main major points how NATO can be revived and what Biden will do?
Again, these are personal views. I'm not representing anyone. Yes, I think if you think about the NATO alliance, as I said, the strategic concept for NATO is 10 years old. It's really out of date. But if you look at what it says the alliance has 3 core tasks. One is collective defense, which is still important. So no, I don't think there's any interest in changing that. It just needs to be updated to the kinds of challenges that the alliance faces today, which are not the ones of 2010. That was written, for instance, before Russian intervention in Ukraine and lots of other issues. The second core task of the alliance is crisis management. And at the time, it was really about, going very far away to Afghanistan and to dealing with, field missions very far from the European theater. Now it's about managing crises closer. The entire Eastern Mediterranean, for instance, is ripe with crises that affect NATO allies. In fact, NATO allies are fighting, are working against each other on many of those issues. So the alliance has to be better on that. The third one is cooperative security. This was a way for allies to have a whole new network of partners to work with. But I would suggest that instead of thinking about just the partnership for peace, this is where, again, China comes in. I think there will be an interesting development of thinking how other allies in Asia might start to at least create new fora or working relationships with NATO. There's something called the Enhanced Opportunities Partners. Australia is one of those, but not Japan or Korea. It doesn't make much sense. So why not do that? I think there's even opportunity for a NATO Indo-Pacific Council in which NATO and democratic allies across the Indo-Pacific region might even have a frame in which they should talk about issues, not only about China, but about global commons, lots of other things. The last point I would say, which is the different one, which is the notion of resilience. The real security challenges I think most people worry about today are not tank armies, although that's real, but disruption to how societies function. It's infrastructure challenges, it's the hybrid challenges, cyber issues. All of those things are very real. They're new tools to disrupt societies. We use this term resilience, but it's a buzzword. It doesn't have operational content. And I think how to protect societies from this type of disruptive challenge is something that we will all have to deal with better, but the alliance could do that. None of that will work, back to my original point, unless there is a coming together on values. And I think you'll see the administration just really focus on that. NATO can't be an alliance that works if it doesn't have a sense of shared values. And I think that'll be the foundational element for all of these tasks and things that I just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very enlightening. Brittany, do you have another question?
Yes, our next question is in regards to China. So if either Sitao or Tom Orlik would like to take this, be my guest. It is from Stephen Wachowski, my bad, who is an economist from Guatemala who also collaborates with UNC and Duke in Chapel Hill. Stephen has a statement and would like to know whether or not you agree. The statement is, China's policy and tactics obviously point that it wants to replace the US as the world's hegemon. Under the cloak of cooperation with the Biden administration, will it continue with this objective? Or it will continue with this objective. Do you agree?
Tom, do you want to try?
Well, I want to first of all thank Brittany for finally teaching me correct pronunciation of hegemon. I've always been going with hegemon, but I'm glad to finally work it out. There's a phrase which often appears in Chinese policy documents, 办好自己的事. It means do your own work well, right? And I think for all of the sort of concern about the implications of China's rise here in the West, actually the big thing on the mind of China's top leaders is actually domestic priorities. It's a country of 1.3 billion people. GDP per capita is a third of the level in the United States. that is a big development challenge. So as China rises, it will have greater heft in the global economy, and we've seen with the Belt and Road Initiative and other things that with that economic rise comes more global influence. But I think probably one reason for optimism about US-China relations in the next 4 years is that both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping are going to focus more on getting their own work done well. And that is overwhelmingly, in both cases, going to mean a focus on domestic challenges.
Thank you very much. Shita, do you have anything else in addition?
Yeah, the answer is no. It's not about pronunciation. It's actually about constraint. So if you look at China's border, if you look at China's relationship with country like Japan, historical reasons. By the way, I don't think Japan would ever join NATO. That would be crazy. If you look at China's economic output versus dependence on energy and all these constraints, China can never be a Pacific power as what the United States has claimed for a very long time. So the answer is really no. And also just a footnote, right? I mean, China's actually per capita GDP is not 1/3 of US yet. Right now it's slightly above 10,000, US about 45. So it's less than 25%. So assuming 4 or 5% growth rate, really next 10 years, at some point, 2030, China, of course, will be an economic juggernaut. But still, per capita GDP will be less than half of the US.
Okay, thanks very much. Dan, just briefly on that EU-China dialogue, which was recently agreed upon by Secretary of State Pompeo and the EU Commission President. Will that continue under Biden administration, or do you think that will be not continue?
That was not serious. That was just a press announcement. I said I think there'll be a very serious US-EU dialogue now on China. And I can't anticipate its frame, but I suggest the logical frame is what I had said earlier. Just take the EU's own frame and explore what it means. Where is China a partner? Where is it a competitor? Where is it a systemic rival? And what does that mean for the United States and its allies or other democracies? I think that will provide a common frame of discussion, not only across the Atlantic, but with a number of other Asian Pacific countries as well. And I think that's what you'll see is new coalitions coming together that are starting to talk about the implications of China's rise for them. And it's not an anti-China coalition. It's understanding it better, but it is the one strength the United States has neglected for 4 years, was its huge network of friends and allies. No other country has that extensive network and has not made use of it. So I would suggest that that's the thing that we'll see. And just to be clear, I did not say Japan would join NATO. I said Japan could potentially be what is the category called enhanced opportunity partner. Japan, works very closely with NATO on a lot of issues, as do Korea and Australia already. They were all active in Afghanistan. We do a lot of training and a lot of things that happens every day. It's not a stretch to think that they would have a consultative mechanism as part of that.
Thank you. Tom, wouldn't such a cooperation on China not regarded as in China as ganging up on China? And wouldn't that be regarded as anti-China, even if the emphasis was that that wasn't the case?
Right. Yeah. So as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, one of the things which the Trump administration has clearly not done very well is work with allies. I think there was one point, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe it was summer 2018, when it seemed like there were trade wars with China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, and Europe all being launched at exactly the same time. not an approach which is calculated to bring allies along with the United States. Now, to the extent that a Biden administration is better at using the telephone, better at building alliances, that's clearly going to be a factor which plays into the US-China relationship as well.
Thank you. Pete, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, we'll offer this question to Dr. Hamilton, but I'd also like to get Ambassador Litt on this question as well. Wouldn't rejoining the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement accomplish many U.S. goals in a non-confrontational manner? And that question is from Stanley Black. And we can start with Dr. Hamilton.
If you had just thought strategically, yes, because the point of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was largely strategic in nature. But I think given the four horsemen of the apocalypse that I mentioned before about domestic challenges, and particularly the idea of trade with in Asia right now, that's a difficult lift domestically in the United States. And Joe Biden has said he's not prepared to go into any trade deals unless it really can show some evidence of support for American workers. Or he has said we're not going to do it until we get those issues back on track. So I think you'll see a reluctance to jump into anything quickly. One should also remember Trade Promotion Authority in the United States rests with the Congress. It's delegated to the executive branch. And that authority expires July 1st. So in the first 6 months of administration, there's going to be some back and forth, as I said, probably with not even a team in place to understand the terms of that trade promotion authority domestically. I think there's a different issue on the Atlantic side. There was something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It was the transatlantic, counterpart to the TPA. It started later. It was frozen when the Trump administration came into office. I don't think there's a lot of appetite to try a huge, ambitious thing like that either. But I do think you'll find a lot of interest in smaller types of arrangements with the EU that will clear away some irritants. As I said, get rid of these national security tariffs on your own allies. That doesn't make any sense to anybody. Maybe you isolate the Boeing Airbus dispute and put it in a box, or try to resolve it so that it doesn't intrude on these other things. Part of the transatlantic economic relationship is not really about trade, because it's mainly free trade already. It's really about regulatory differences. And there you find a new alignment again between a Democratic administration and the EU about high standards. Labor standards, environmental standards, those kinds of things that you can advance together globally. And I think you'll see a new sort of coming together on some of that, even though the US and the EU have differences, as I mentioned, particularly on the digital part of that.
Okay, thanks very much. David?
I do not claim to be an expert or experienced by any stretch of the imagination in the Pacific, but from what I understand about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it represented an effort by the United States to set the agenda for economic relationships under terms, values in economic relations that the United States wants to promote and advocate and be the leader of. And when we withdrew from that, we left a space for China, frankly, to promote its own view of how the Pacific economic arrangements ought to look like. I would argue that the United States should be doing more of that. Whether we return to the TPP or not, I don't know. It is a partnership after all. It is not a set of negotiated trade agreements. But I think it also represents an important effort by the United States to resurrect the power of diplomacy, economic diplomacy, and other kinds of diplomacy, and the use of our economic power so that we're not always reaching for that military tool.
Thank you very much. Brittany, do you have some more questions?
Yes, and Professor, you might have to help me direct this question. It's from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, have the State Department and other government departments been gutted irreparably from this current administration? And are there too many vacancies to get this work done?
I think that's again a question for David.
The Department of State has been gutted. I don't know that it's necessarily irreparably. I think that smart people with goodwill and with an understanding of how a diplomatic institution ought to work, like George Shultz did when he was Secretary of State, or Colin Powell did when he was Secretary of State, and someone like Bill Burns could, as a future Secretary of State, recreate the kinds of personnel policies, promotion policies, favoring career professionals over political appointees, not to the exclusion of political appointees, because there's an important role for political appointees, but to just redesign American diplomacy. And there is no absence of good ideas for how to do that. But it's going to take an awful long time, not just to craft the strategy, but put it into motion, because as for any large institution, this is going to take many years to work itself through.
And maybe that is of interest to the students who are watching. Will there be a new recruitment drive in the State Department for young diplomats?
I can only hope that there will. I can with the team that President-elect Biden has put together. I think there's every reason to believe that we will look at how more effectively to recruit among students in particular, but also from other fields. There's a consideration of whether we should start bringing in Foreign Service officers more laterally, because that's been hollowed out and gutted, as you say, and also to make sure that Foreign Service appeals to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans who do not apply to the Foreign Service in sufficient numbers. So I think there's going to be an effort to do that.
Mm-hmm. Does Dan, you have any further information on that? Otherwise, we go on.
I've already noticed there is an active effort to do this active recruiting that David just mentioned. So I do say, especially we're talking to this type of audience, that there may be some, revived opportunities for people. And I think the State Department is actively looking now to reconsider how it does its whole hiring, all of its kinds of practices. There might be some fertile ground there. I would say it's not just the State Department, it's probably most of the US government. And many other agencies of the US government work internationally. Everyone thinks of the State Department. But if you think of an US embassy, an embassy is a platform for all the agencies of the US government. And most of them have people stationed abroad. They also are going to be looking for the same type of quality. So I think maybe there's something there.
Thank you. And to all the future US ambassadors who are watching now, please keep in mind you first heard it here on the Krasno Global Events Series. Pete, do you have another question?
Yes, this question is for Mr. Orlik. It's from Alan Vo. Why would a smooth transition to our carbon neutral economy yield differential benefits to China and the US?
So there's two things here. So the first one is, who loses more if temperatures rise? And the answer to that is, it's countries which are already hot, so countries which are nearer the equator, countries which have a large coastal population, so almost all of China's population live on the east coast, and countries which have less capacity to put in place measures which would protect the population from the impact of climate change. So in general, developing emerging markets have less capacity to do that than advanced economies. So if temperatures rise, it's worse for those countries than it is for Northern Hemisphere advanced economies. And then the second part of it is, well, why would a sort of a bumpy or poorly managed transition to carbon neutral be worse for some countries than for others? And the reason is that if the transition is bumpy and poorly managed, then there will be less time for advances in technology to take the strain. And if there's less time for advances in technology to take the strain, then countries which then countries which lag in terms of technological capacity will face a bigger drag on their GDP growth.
Thanks very much. Let me bring in Svetlana, because gas and oil is, of course, the products which Russia depends on for its economy. Would climate change and climate regulations, better climate security and better technology, would that also be a basis for cooperation between Russia and the United States, as it may be between China and the United States?
Yes, of course, for Russia, environmental challenges are very serious challenges. But I don't see, unfortunately, much of cooperation in this area. First of all, economic relations between the United States and Russia are almost non-existent. There are sanctions on people connected to Putin who are running the oil and gas business in Russia. There are sanctions. There's a lot of pressure from the United States on Nord Stream right now. And there is active competition going on in the Arctic. So if you look at all these factors, unfortunately, there is not much space for cooperation on gas, oil, and how that relates to climate change right now.
Right, thank you. Maybe we'll take another question, Brittany.
Sure. So the next question focuses on the US-NATO alliance, and more specifically, just US alliances in general. It is from Ga Hao Hu from UNC-Chapel Hill. For US partners in Europe, will US shift towards a stronger relationship with Germany rather than the UK? Where will the US stand in a new relationship between the UK, Germany, and France? And I would think to throw this to Dr. Hamilton.
Yeah.
Well, I've already mentioned the NATO framework, so I won't revisit that. This seems more like the role of big powers within alliances. So the UK is leaving the EU, but it's not leaving NATO. So its role in NATO now becomes actually quite important, and it'll be very keen on showing that it's a strong NATO ally. France and Germany have to sort out their relationship. They don't seem to be doing too well at it, frankly. The German chancellor is stepping down, and the Germans will have their own elections next year with a new leader, and that'll be interesting what type of coalition, which will come. So some of it depends on that. But clearly Germany is becoming, the central hub in Europe. Part of it is because of abdication, frankly, of the other larger powers. It's not because the Germans are, actively seeking it, but it's falling to them. But there are many, concerns within Europe, frankly, of greater German influence as well. The US has always played a role, frankly, reassuring Europeans about Germany and reassuring the Germans about themselves. In the last few years, that source of reassurance has become a source of anxiety. And I think Joe Biden is probably going to do a lot of quick work to sort of restore the US as a source of reassurance to Europeans rather than the opposite. President Trump announced in a tweet that he would be removing all sorts of troops from Germany. I think on day one, that's already been announced that the Biden administration will freeze that announcement and reconsider it. So I don't think you'll see that happening anytime soon, which I think will be an important. I have no problem with force, reviewing force posture, but it should be done in some strategic way. And by doing it within the strategic concept review that I mentioned will be one way to do that. I think the more difficult issues will be maybe with some other allies like Poland. Poland has identified, basically threw in its lot with the Trump administration. And I think there's concern they have now that they might have done too much of that, and what will now a Biden administration do? I think they forget it was the Democrats who got Poland into NATO, not the Republicans, and that there's strong U.S. support for Poland. But there are this question of democratic backsliding in countries like Poland and Hungary and Turkey will become, tension within the alliance that will have to be dealt with. So it's frankly more going to be those kinds of issues rather than the UK, Britain, and France that I think will be preoccupying for the relationship.
Thank you very much. We are rapidly running out of time, but I would suggest, as we still have quite a few questions people would like to ask, that we hang on for a bit if the panelists are not too exhausted and try to address these questions. Pete, would you ask the next question?
Yes, this is from Daniel Babb. We'll offer this to Mr. Orlik and Sital. Will we see any consequences for the CCP coming from the Biden administration for their actions concerning the South China Sea, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the eruption of COVID-19? Or will we see an attitude of reconciliation take place instead?
Sital, do you want to try?
Sure. I mean, if you really look at a timeline, right? U.S. started pivot to Asia when Obama visited Australia. I think 2012, 2011 actually. 2012, Vice President then Xi Jinping visited United States, being greeted by President Obama. So then also in between, China made an announcement on 9-line. So you can see, depending which angle you view this, but I really think mistrust start building up during those years. So the question is, what's going to happen? I think at this moment, clearly, neither side wants to see worsening relationship. And I really dismiss the likelihood of even a skirmish in South China Sea. I just don't see that. And of course, China has to manage the relationship with the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia more effectively. That's South China Sea. Taiwan, to what extent U.S. would upgrade relationship with Taipei? In past, Taiwan's president had transit visit, for example, going through Hawaii to Latin America. Now, do you think that could happen in New York City? I'm not too sure, but of course, U.S. will sell more arms to Taiwan. But I would stress, I think Biden administration is going to trade a very fine line.
Thank you. Tom, do you agree with that?
Wholeheartedly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tom.
You want to go on a little?
Oh, sorry, I thought I would get away with that. I thought I would get away with wholehearted agreement. So look, I think part of the job of diplomacy is separating values and interests, right? So countries can say to each other, our values are different in this area. We have shared interests in this area. That hasn't been something which has been very obvious in US-China relations in the last 4 years. And that's one of the reasons why relations have deteriorated so much. Maybe a future administration will do a better job of piecing those two things out.
Thanks very much. Brittany, no, was it Brittany? I can't remember. Who asked the last question? Yeah, why don't you go and ask the next question, please?
So the next question will be for Ambassador Litt. It is from Brian Keeliff, who is a self-proclaimed Krasno loyalist. The question is about viability and feasibility. Several of our remarkable panelists have outlined all of the treaties and relationships that need resuscitation and renegotiation. Is that not too heavy a load of work and expectations if this is to happen in a quick time?
Wholeheartedly. Yeah. Yes, clearly. Negotiating agreements takes an awful long time. There's no such thing as a quick fix. And anyone who thinks they can put together a quick fix finds that it unravels pretty quickly, just as well. So that we have a long way to go. Negotiating with Iran over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, took years and years and years just to get Iran to the table. Negotiating with between the Israelis and the Arabs has taken decades. So the notion that somehow we're going to be able to return to the JCPOA, for example, that we will sign on right away and it starts where we left off, is not going to happen because 5 years have passed. So that we have to figure out what now is going to occur according to the JCPOA and adjust it for the fact that Iran has backtracked, as has the United States. And this would go for any agreements that we need to reestablish, certainly in the Middle East, if we're ever going to get any hope of agreements with respect to Yemen, for example, or with respect to Syria, where the United States has very little role to play today, unfortunately, because we yielded that to Iran, Turkey, and Russia. So any agreements that we become party to or return to, it's going to take a long time to reestablish. But after all, that's the nature of diplomacy, and that's the nature of international relations.
Thanks very much. Pete, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, we are seeing a rise in authoritarian and decline in democratic governments in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. What are some steps the Biden administration could do to address this? And we'll offer this to anyone who wants to answer it.
Let's go to Russia and go to Svetlana. Talk to us about whether it's possible, to really improve relations also in a personal way with Putin. Because we know that Biden said he looked into Putin's blue eyes and he didn't see a soul. So
in part, I would like to go back to the question that Pete asked, and Biden answered that question in his article in Foreign Affairs. I think to address the fact that democracy is sliding and authoritarian countries, authoritarian elements are rising in the political life of many countries. First step is to really improve and strengthen democracy in the United States and heal these incredible ruptures, the polarization that we're experiencing here. And I think the other way which would partly repair relations with countries like Russia is for the United States to be consistent and pursue human rights, but pursue human rights not in a way that is just convenient where strategic interests are involved. In other words, picking the situations where rhetorically we're doing something for human rights, but in fact, it's more of the strategic imperative that we're pursuing. In other words, not to be hypocritical in pursuit of human rights.
Thank you.
That would be very helpful across the board dealing with these countries that are sluggish.
That's a good point. That reminds me of Saudi Arabia. So will that a strategically important country, which has not the best human rights records on earth, will that be taken to task by the Biden administration, or will strategic reasons still prevail? David Litt, what do you think?
It's not either or. The Biden administration will very much hammer Saudi Arabia for its egregious human rights violations, first and foremost among which is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. American diplomacy has done this in the past over and over again, where we can, as they proverbially say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We can criticize countries for human rights violations, but also seek to work with them to achieve solutions in other domains. That's the skill of diplomacy. And maybe you don't, you choose vehicles for expressing your outrage that are not just spreading it over some newspaper. We need newspapers, and I don't mean to belittle newspapers, but rather you can perform your diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, quietly behind the scenes and in ways that the other country knows that there are prices to pay for policies and actions that they take, and that there are benefits for eschewing those kinds of policies or choosing other paths.
Thanks very much. The next question, please.
The next question is from Yunzi Chin from London School of Economics and Political Science in London. The question is for Mr. Thomas Orlik and Mr. Sitaozu. Considering that restoring market confidence is a crucial component of COVID-19 recovery plan, to what extent does the positive economic forecast of China matter to U.S. foreign policy making and the Biden administration?
Well,
you'll go first.
Thanks, Sitao. I'm pleased someone finally has referred to me as Mr. Thomas Orlik. I was getting fed up with everyone else getting a doctor in front of their name and no Mr. for me. So thank you very much, Yunja. So look, sometimes I don't know if anyone's read it, but there's a very good book by my old Wall Street Journal colleagues, Bob Davis and Ling Wei, about the U.S.-China trade war, Superpower Showdown. It's a kind of blow-by-blow account of how the U.S. and China thought about the trade conflict over the last few years. And at various points in it, people pop up and they tell Donald Trump, oh, China's at a really weak point with their economy now. They're ready to make a deal. And Donald Trump apparently believes these people, and he kind of tries to exert more pressure on China because he thinks maybe Q3 GDP is going to be weak, so they'll be ready to sign out to make some concessions. I think the reality is that relations between great powers are not determined by the ups and downs of the economic cycle. It might very well be that China will come out of the COVID crisis a bit faster and a bit stronger than the US. They will have stronger growth this year. They'll probably have stronger growth next year. Does that change something fundamental in the strategic relationship? Is that going to kind of affect the sort of the way diplomacy is done in 2020 and 2021? No, I don't think so. I think that the diplomatic relationship is something which is based on, longer term trajectories.
Sitao, you want to come in?
Yeah. Yes. I agree with Tom completely. Short-term economic forecasts really, they really don't matter. What we have seen in past few years, particularly during trade war, I think China, I wouldn't say China only takes US seriously. Well, I'm not implying China doesn't take Europe seriously, but clearly this is the most important relationship from China's perspective. I think so far, China is making a lot of concessions, especially in the area of financial liberalization. So I would expect Biden administration to really focus on market access, because there are really too many issues to be dealt with. If you want to bring internet, state-owned enterprises, you can't do too many things at the same time. So I would stress really just market access, maybe subsidies of state-owned enterprises.
Okay, thank you very much. Can
Klaus,
I suggest?
I must apologize. I'm going to have to leave.
Yes, I understand.
Okay.
Thank you to you and your colleagues. It was a great session. I appreciate it.
No, thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much for providing us with your insights. Most illuminating.
Klaus, I'm afraid I'm going to have to step away as well, but it was an amazing discussion.
I was just suggesting to have a couple of more questions, and then we'll say goodbye tonight. But again, Tom, thanks very much for joining us tonight. And maybe I can ask our two assistants to ask one final question each, and then we'll finish for tonight. Pete, you want to ask the first one?
Yes, we have a question. We'll offer it to Mr. C. Tao. Focusing on isolating, will the U.S. focus on isolating China diplomatically and economically in a Biden administration, or should we expect that it'll work towards cooperating more with China in the future?
I think on containment and the competition in technology area, I don't think that would change. But I think the restrictions will be more selective. I think the word I'm using is finesse. I think Biden administration is going to be more careful. I don't think you are going to see TikTok incident. I actually think the restriction. Actually, I don't think TikTok has nothing to do with national security. So those type of things, unlikely. You could see Houston consulate to reopen under Biden administration, and of course, China is going to reopen Chengdu consulate. As I said earlier, my prediction is Biden would visit Beijing within a year.
Thank you. And the final question for Brittany.
So Daniel Babb would like to follow up the previous question in U.S.-China relations. And the question is, as you said, right now between China and the U.S., peace and working together are in both of our interests. What set of circumstances would need to arise for active war to be in both of our interests? Is that even conceivable in our current global paradigm?
And I would like, before we start answering, perhaps that is a good question we could ask all of our remaining panelists to apply whether there is the danger of military conflict in the Middle East, in Russia, or between China and the United States, because that, after all, is the most important question of all the questions we have asked tonight.
Yeah, Klaus already said no, so I won't. I already gave the answer no.
What about Taiwan? There's no danger that if anything happens with Taiwan?
I mean, it's a flashpoint, right? Source of tension, but I think it will be managed.
The declaration of independence by Taiwan?
No.
Okay, I actually agree with you. Okay, Svetlana.
So I can leave now?
What? If you
so
wish.
I can leave?
If you wish, yeah.
Okay.
No, thank you very much, Shitao, and I hope you'll see
you thank you.
The Krasno series soon.
Okay, thank you.
Svetlana, do you want to address it?
I think the danger of accidental nuclear conflict is very high because, as I mentioned before, there is no structure of dialogue and there is no process of negotiations that Russians and Americans are involved. Intentional war, I would say no, practically not possible, but miscalculation, overreaction, accidental launch, all these I think are more likely than they were in the Cold War.
Okay, okay, that's a sober assessment. David, are you more optimistic regarding the Middle East?
Well, with respect to war in the Middle East, there's two things to be said. We are most likely not to have the same kind of war as we saw in 1948, 1967, or 1973 with tanks and airplanes and the like, except for the possibility of war between any group of nations and Iran. But the Arab states of the Gulf are not going to engage in war with Iran, and the Iranians are not going to invade the Arab states. But a situation between Israel and Iran, with Israel supported by others, that is something we always have to pay attention to. And I think the United States, well, the Biden administration, I believe, will go a long way to lower the temperature, to prevent that kind of situation from rising. But make no mistake, the Middle East is already a region at war. There is already conflicts everywhere from North Africa to Iran and beyond in Afghanistan. So the challenge is already there, and the challenge for the United States, as I mentioned in my my opening remarks for the Biden administration, is to bring down that temperature and help to resolve those conflicts that are ongoing.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank David Litt and Svetlana Savranskaya, if I pronounce it correctly, and of course also Tom Orlik and Sitao Shu, and everyone else for being here, Daniel Hamilton, of course. Thank you very much for this interesting session on what to expect in the future regarding Biden and perhaps beyond. That was a very long and intensive session, but there were so many questions from the audience, I did not want to cut it short too much. Next week, we have our final event this semester. That at that stage, Bill Crystal and John Judis will talk about whether there will be socialism in the United States or perhaps a revival of neoconservatism. That is next week, November 18 at 5:30 p.m. For tonight, thank you very much again to all our panelists, also to Brittany and Pete, of course, and to you, all our many viewers. It's much appreciated that many of you kept here until the bitter end. And I'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.